Today, we are meeting with Eric Dryban, the Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division and the Department of Justice. In addition to his work in the private sector, Mr. Dryban has served in several positions over the years throughout our federal government, including as the General Counsel on the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission from 2003 to 2005. And as Deputy Administrator of the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division, and we welcome you, sir. For more than 60 years, the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice has been a shining example to our nation. It has fought for marginalized communities, protected basic rights, and ensured justice for all communities. In communities of color, the Civil Rights Division holds a place of reverence that is well earned through a record of achievement. The mission of the division is essential to ensuring that all Americans receive equal protection under the law. Sadly, that proud record of service is in peril under this administration. The attacks on long-standing precedents and effective policies have been unending, from preventing the use of consent decrees and addressing systemic issues with local law enforcement, to a lack of enforcement of the Voting Rights Act, to rescinding guidance protecting transgender students. The department has pulled back on policies that have protected millions. The department has also chosen to change sides on cases involving cornerstone civil rights issues like affirmative action and discriminatory voting laws. Earlier this year, the Washington Post reported that the Justice Department had been tasked with analyzing current disparate impact guidance and policies, any revision of which could severely undermine our fair housing laws. The pace of these changes is dizzying and disturbing. Many of them undermine the core mission of the Civil Rights Division. Last month, in what can only be described as a Freudian slip, the President praised the, quote, abolition of civil rights, end of quote. Unfortunately, that statement hits far too close to the truth. This subcommittee intends to look at the work of the Civil Rights Division very carefully, and we expect that the dollars we appropriate to the department will be used in a manner that protects the vulnerable communities the division has stood up on behalf of for many decades. Once again, we welcome you, Assistant Attorney General Dryban, and we look forward to your testimony. Before I proceed, let me just say that my comment before really was sincerely spoken. Growing up politically and growing up physically, but certainly politically, the Justice Department was that place that you looked to for fairness and for coming in, basically, and straightening things out when they were being unfair. That's why a lot of us are sad at what we think is happening in the Justice Department, especially in this division. Mr. Adderhall?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Dryban. Good to have you here today, and we're especially glad to have you here to discuss this important issue, really fundamental issue of the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice. The division of the Department of Justice has the solemn responsibility, as you know, of ensuring that civil and constitutional rights of all Americans, particularly some of the most vulnerable members of our society, are upheld. I commend you and your team for your steadfast efforts to protect the rights of all individuals to live free of violence, discrimination, and exploitation, to safeguard the fundamental infrastructure of democracy, and ensure that all have an equal opportunity to learn, earn a living, live where we choose, and worship freely. I have a particular interest in the enforcement of the federal statutes prohibiting discrimination on the basis of religion. Religious freedom has been a core American principle since the founding of this nation. For this reason and for others, I wish to commend the Civil Rights Division, the United States attorneys, as well as your federal enforcement partners for your successful prosecution of the horrific, heartbreaking attack on the African-American worshipers at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, as both a vile hate crime and abhorrent assault on the free exercise of religion. In addition to religious liberty and the fundamental rights of due process and equal protection under the law, I look forward to discussing the division's extensive efforts to safeguard the integrity of our elections and also address the scourge of human trafficking, among other vital pursuits. Again, I thank the chairman for holding this very important hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you. Try to keep, Mr. Dryban, your comments to 5 minutes, but we assure you that your full testimony will be inserted in the record.
Thank you, Chairman Serrano and Ranking Member Adderhold and members of the committee for the opportunity to speak with you today. It is an honor to serve as the Assistant Attorney General and as the voice of the women and men of the Civil Rights Division at the United States Department of Justice. Thank you also for making time today for this important hearing. As you know, the Civil Rights Division works to uphold the civil and constitutional rights of all, including some of our most vulnerable members of our society. We enforce several civil and criminal statutes, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Fair Housing Act, and the Shepherd-Bird Hate Crimes Prevention Act, among others. The division currently has approximately 567 full-time employees, including 369 attorneys. The division's fiscal year allocation from the General Legal Activities account is $148.2 million. The Civil Rights Division remains focused on a variety of priorities. These include prosecuting hate crimes, prosecuting human traffickers and destroying transnational organized trafficking networks, prosecuting those who violate federal race discrimination laws, combating unlawful hiring practices against U.S. workers, enforcing federal laws that protect service members, veterans, and their families, protecting voting rights, safeguarding religious freedom, ensuring that individuals have access to treatment for opioid addiction and are free from discrimination, combating sexual harassment and abuse. The Attorney General has made hate crimes prosecutions a priority, and the department launched a hate crimes enforcement and prevention initiative. The Civil Rights Division leads that initiative and coordinates the department's efforts to eradicate hate crime. Since January of 2017, the department has convicted more than 40 defendants for hate crimes violations. The division also plays a lead role in the department's efforts to enforce laws against human trafficking, including both sex trafficking and forced labor. From 2013 to 2017, the division, in partnership with U.S. attorneys' offices around the country, brought 427 human trafficking cases, which is an 82% increase from the prior 4-year period. The division has also launched several other initiatives. The Protecting U.S. Workers Initiative seeks to identify employers who abuse temporary visa programs and combats employment discrimination against U.S. workers. The division's Americans with Disabilities Act voting initiative seeks to ensure that people with disabilities have an equal opportunity to participate in the voting process. The division entered into its most recent settlement agreement under this initiative just 2 weeks ago. The division has also zealously protected the right to vote under other federal statutes, including the Voting Rights Act, the Uniformed and Overseas Absentee Voting Act, the National Voter Registration Act, and the Help America Vote Act. Since January of 2017, the United States has participated in 6 cases brought under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The federal appellate courts resolved 3 of those cases, and in each case, the courts adopt the position adopted by the Justice Department. The other 3 cases remain pending. And since January 2017, the Civil Rights Division has entered into settlement agreements with Arizona and Wisconsin to protect the voting rights of military and other overseas voters, and with Kentucky and Connecticut to ensure compliance with federal law requirements regarding the maintenance of complete and accurate voter registration rolls. In April 2018, and timed to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, the division launched the Sexual Harassment in Housing Initiative. The division has opened a record number of investigations and filed a record number of sexual harassment, pattern or practice lawsuits in federal court. The division's Religious Discrimination Initiative works with U.S. attorney offices to combat religious discrimination in schools, and the Place to Worship Initiative seeks to increase enforcement and public awareness of the land use provisions of the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. Finally, last year, the division and the department commemorated the 50th anniversary of the tragic assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Every section of the Civil Rights Division plays a role in seeking to make Dr. King's vision of a nation free from racial prejudice a reality, and the division is committed to continue its efforts to eliminate race discrimination in this country. Chairman Serrano, Ranking Member Adderholt, and members of the committee, your support allows the Civil Rights Division to protect the civil rights of all Americans. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. We apologize for the door. It was left over from Halloween, and it's the best I could do today. Yes. Ever since the Supreme Court's Shelby County versus Holder ruling ended some federal oversight under the Voting Rights Act, there has been a historic increase in the threat and reality of voter suppression. The House last week passed H.R. 1 to reform voting rights protection and upgrade election security, among other things. Question: how many cases is the division, either the voting section or the criminal section, working in Georgia and in Florida?
Well, Chairman Serrano, as you know, the right to vote is one of the most important rights we have. It is secured by both the Constitution of the United States and several laws, including the Voting Rights Act. As I mentioned in my opening statement, we have participated in various ways through litigation and otherwise in 6 Section 2 Voting Rights Act cases since 2017. With respect to ongoing investigations, voting or other matters, I cannot comment on those, but I can assure you that the message that I've delivered to the voting section of the Civil Rights Division, as well as the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division, is that we are committed to aggressive and zealous enforcement of all of the laws within our jurisdiction, including the Voting Rights Act in particular. That law, as you know, was enacted in 1965, and it was primarily designed to combat race discrimination in voting, but it does reach other areas as well, and ensures protections for people who struggle with English language, for example, and other protections as well.
So with that in mind, how does the Civil Rights Division prioritize efforts and manage its election-related workload?
Well, we do that in many different ways. So we, for example, have settled cases to ensure the integrity of state voter laws. We also, in the 2016 and 2018 elections, dispersed several people throughout the United States to monitor the polls. In fact, in the 2018 election, I spent much of the day with a command center run by our criminal section and with our voting section attorneys who were monitoring in real time as voting was actually happening. Complaints, concerns that people were raising. We worked in coordination with the Federal Bureau of Investigation to both monitor the activities on that day and in addition disperse people throughout the United States to several jurisdictions to monitor the voting and report on any problems that anyone saw. We also conduct investigations in the various states around the country to ensure that they are complying with the federal voting laws. And then, of course, we engage in litigation through the federal court system, of course, various federal laws within our jurisdiction. Obviously, we prefer to settle cases if we can, and oftentimes we're encouraged that states will work with us to reach an appropriate resolution to a dispute, but if we have to, we're prepared to litigate and do litigate cases in the federal courts throughout the United States.
Now, I know you can't get into specific cases, but do we know what the top number of complaints are in voting-related issues?
Chairman Serrano, I don't know that data off the top of my head, but we do take complaints from the public, and our voting section investigates complaints. Our criminal section does as well, and we work with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and at times other components of the federal government as well. For example, the Department of Homeland Security. And other aspects of the executive branch of the government to investigate complaints, either alleged violations of the Voting Rights Act, the National Voter Registration Act, the Help America Vote Act, and other laws as well.
Could you at a later date give the committee some numbers just for our information of what's the number one complaint, you know?
Chairman Serrano, I will certainly take that back to the department and working with our Office of Legislative Affairs, provide you with whatever data we can to satisfy concerns you may have, as well as other members of the subcommittee.
Thank you. H.R. 1 as passed by the House would add significant new election system protections. If enacted, how would voting section workload be affected? What resources would help you carry out your mission as you understand H.R. 1?
Chairman Serrano, I'm not familiar with H.R. 1 and would look forward to reviewing the bill and in consultation with the many dedicated and career attorneys in our voting section, talk with them. Our policy section of the Civil Rights Division would also look at it. And then I'd be happy to take it back and work with you and your colleagues on it, as well as in conjunction with what we have at the Justice Department. It's called our Office of Legislative Affairs. That office provides a liaison, as you know, between this subcommittee and other committees of the House of Representatives, and it's something that we would look at and weigh in as appropriate.
Ms. Sadaho.
Thank you. Of course, as we've talked about, the Civil Rights Division, of course, is charged with the overseeing the U.S. Voting rights laws. And you've talked a little bit about it, but could you describe the efforts that you undertook in your division, particularly during the 2016, the 2018 elections, to monitor compliance with the federal voting rights laws?
Sure. In both the 2016 election and the 2018 election, Ranking Member Adderholt, the Civil Rights Division, as well as other components of the Justice Department, dispersed literally hundreds of people throughout the United States to monitor the polls in several dozen states at several locations. And what we did was we took recommendation from the experts we have in our voting section about where we should send people, and particularly with respect to areas of concern based on their judgment. Many of these individuals in our voting section have worked at the department for several decades and devoted their professional lives to protecting the right to vote. And so what we do is we take their, and what we did was we took their recommendations and generally followed them, and then many people went out throughout the United States and monitored the polls as people were voting. Meanwhile, back in Washington, we had people from our voting section as well as our criminal section working with the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security to monitor through our command center indications of potential violations of any of the voting laws, and to do what we could even on election day to take prompt action if any was appropriate. And then later, of course, if investigations were warranted, we would investigate any allegations of violations of the right to vote. And in addition, I was particularly heartened when I first joined the department to see that many of our attorneys and other staff in the Civil Rights Division who do not focus on voting laws, that is, they're focused on, say, for example, disability discrimination or other forms of discrimination, they volunteered themselves on the election day to help take in complaints or reports of alleged violations of the Voting Rights Act or other laws, and worked very hard to do that.
Oh, can you talk a little bit about or give us some examples of the type of potential violations that you were on the lookout for in the 2018 and 2016 elections?
Sure. Well, the voting rights laws protect everything from the right to vote to be free of race and other forms of discrimination, to protections related to Americans and service members who are overseas and their right to vote. And so, as well as the right to have access to the ballot for certain jurisdictions where people may struggle with the English language, for example. And so we look at all of those areas with respect to the laws and the standards that govern the laws within our jurisdiction about the right to vote. Our voting rights attorneys and and other staff and investigators look for those things. They take in reports of any kind of violation of that sort, and then we do what we can either immediately or to remedy the problem if we find one, and or to investigate allegations after the fact as well.
What, can you talk about a little bit about the enforcement tools that you have available?
Well, we have many enforcement tools available. The enforcement tools that we have do vary by statute. There are some statutes on the civil side that grant us the authority to subpoena documents and other information and witnesses. We obviously, our criminal section, working with the FBI, works through the normal law enforcement process that the Congress has set up for the criminal laws of this country, including the use of grand juries. We have access to the federal courts, depending on the particular kind of case or matter that may be involved, either through civil lawsuits or criminal prosecutions. And we have staff. We have everything from architects who deal with disability rights issues to access to voting places by those individuals with disabilities. We have people who speak various languages who help us work with very vulnerable populations throughout the United States. And we try to utilize the tools that the Congress has given us to use to the best we can to try to eliminate all forms of discrimination within this country by using the statutes that the Congress has authorized us to prosecute and investigate.
Okay, let me get in one more question if I could. The National Voter Registration Act, of course, is the law that's designed to expand registration opportunities for all citizens and ensure proper maintenance of voter registration list. And states are required to keep voter list accurate and also current. Can you talk about the role that proper maintenance of voter registration lists play in the national voting integrity effort? Sure.
There are two federal laws that the Congress has enacted that ensure the integrity of the state lists of voters, the National Voter Registration Act and the Help America Vote Act. And I think the design of those laws, as meant by Congress, was to ensure that the integrity of the voting system, to ensure that states satisfy their duty under federal law to make sure that their lists of voters are accurate, to prevent voter fraud, and to protect the rights of all Americans to know that when they cast their ballot, they are doing it through a fair process, and that the states have a duty to maintain that process and to protect all of our right to vote when we go to the polls.
And then lastly, is there any examples of litigation regarding these, regarding the maintenance of voter lists that you've brought in the past?
Yes. As I said earlier, Ranking Member Adderholt, we try, if we can, to settle any kind of disputes within our jurisdiction if we can reach an appropriate settlement without litigation. And so with respect to the integrity of the voting list, we were able to settle the matters with the states of Kentucky and Connecticut, and it's mentioned in my statement for the record. And I commend both the states of Kentucky and Connecticut for doing so. In addition, the Justice Department participated in a matter pending before the Supreme Court of the United States involving the voter rolls in the state of Ohio. And the Supreme Court agreed with the Justice Department that the state of Ohio's efforts to comply with the National Voter Registration Act and the Help America Voter Act was fully compliant.
Was not?
Was compliant. No, that Ohio complied with the law.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we will begin our 5-minute per member round, and you know what this means. Mr. Wright, Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Dryban, thank you for joining us. I want to make sure I have a clear understanding of your role at the Civil Rights Division. Your job is to pursue civil rights cases against discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, disability, religion, familial status and national origin. Am I correct in that?
Representative Cartwright, the protected categories do vary from statute to statute, but the categories that you mentioned are among those that are vested within our jurisdiction. And as the Assistant Attorney General, it's my job to direct and help our career staff, our lawyers and investigators enforce those very important protections against
Do
discrimination.
you agree that a primary purpose of both the Civil Rights Division and our federal civil rights laws, including Title VII, the ADA and the ADEA, is to protect the rights of the marginalized and vulnerable communities?
Title VII of the Civil Rights Act does protect against race, color, national origin, religion, and sex discrimination in employment. It's one of the most important laws that we enforce. It was enacted as part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Americans with Disabilities Act, of course, protects against disability discrimination, both in employment and with respect to various programs of state and local governments and public accommodations.
I don't mean to be impolite, but they only give me 5 minutes, and I have a chairman who's going to be banging that gavel on me any minute. That was a yes or no question, and I take it's a yes. Public records indicate the Civil Rights Division has started 60% fewer civil rights cases under President Trump than under the first 2 years of President Obama, and also 50% fewer cases than under President George W. Bush. Do you know if that's an accurate assessment?
Representative Cartwright, I don't know what numbers you're referring to. What I do know, though, is that we have brought a record number of cases under the Fair Housing Act through our sexual harassment initiative. We have brought a significant increase in human trafficking prosecutions. We have participated and brought several other cases under many of the other laws within our jurisdiction.
Okay, so you don't know. Do you agree that the biggest decline in new filings has been in the areas of systemic enforcement misconduct and violation of disability rights?
Representative Cartwright, I'm not sure what you're referring to there. The message that I have consistently expressed to the various sections of the Civil Rights Division, including our Disability Rights section, is that we are committed to zealous and aggressive enforcement of the civil rights laws.
Are you telling me that enforcement actions have increased or stayed the same, or are you agreeing with me that they have declined since the last two administrations?
Well, Representative Cartwright, enforcement efforts with respect to many of the areas of our jurisdiction have increased, including, as I said, under our sexual harassment and housing initiative. We've brought a record number of investigations and a record number of pattern and practice sexual harassment lawsuits.
I asked you about violation of disability rights. Have those gone up, have they gone down, or have they stayed the same? And if you don't know, it's okay, you can tell us.
Representative Cartwright, with respect to disability rights, I'm not sure what you're referring to.
The Americans with Disabilities Act, I think you actually even mentioned that. Mr. Dryban, the decline is deeply concerning to me. That's why I'm asking these questions. Americans with disabilities are less likely to be employed today than they were before the ADA was enacted in 1990. Those that do work are often in low-paying jobs and earn considerably less than someone without a disability. Isn't systemic pay and job discrimination an indicator of a need for increased enforcement?
Representative Cartwright, I agree with you that zealous and aggressive enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act is critically important to the protection of rights of the individuals with disabilities in this country. We enforce that law in various ways, including in particular with respect to the right to vote. We have an initiative committed solely to the voting rights of individuals with disabilities to make sure that they have access to their right to vote. But we also enforce the Americans with Disabilities Act in the employment within the jurisdiction that we have. Our jurisdiction with respect to employment is limited to public employers. and we do enforce that law, and we enforce it in many other ways as well.
Would you mind if I followed up with your office, because we don't seem to see eye to eye on the statistics. It is clear to us that enforcement of civil rights cases has decreased dramatically under this administration, and I want to see if we can pin you down on that. And if we can, I want to seek a commitment from you to reverse that trend. Will you work with our office?
Well, Representative Cartwright, first of all, I'm fully committed to aggressive and zealous enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act and to all of the laws within our jurisdiction. With respect to working with you and your colleagues on the subcommittee, I work through our Office of Legislative Affairs at the Department of Justice, and would be delighted to work with you and your colleagues as appropriate.
All right. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Palazzo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you being here today. I'd like to address your office's attempts to prosecute human trafficking. We know human trafficking is prolific in the United States. And looking through some of the notes here, you point out that Mexico is the country of origin of the largest number of foreign-born human trafficking victims identified in the United States. And of course, several reasons, probably because we have a large 2,000-mile contiguous border with Mexico, and that border is not secure, and at any given time, drugs, human trafficking, foreign nationals with intent to do Americans harm can just cross our border. Could you tell me a little bit about, and I know Ann Wagner, our colleague in the House, has been leading this effort for several years to address human trafficking, and she's done a wonderful job. Even my home state is taking this extremely seriously and passing legislation to increase the penalties of human trafficking, and our law enforcement are actively engaged. Can you tell me a little bit more about what your office is doing, and do you see a trend, upward trend or downward trend based on our efforts, and can we do more?
Yes, we have what we call our Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit, which is part of our criminal section of the Civil Rights Division, and that unit coordinates efforts throughout the federal government with the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, United States Attorney offices, and even the Mexican government, among others, to deal with this problem of human trafficking. We do see a problem whereby human traffickers will smuggle people across the border from Mexico into the United States for the purpose of human trafficking, both with respect to sex trafficking and forced labor. Is a very serious problem, and it's one where we have seen a significant increase in the number of prosecutions. In fact, approximately 82% increase from 2013 to 2017 compared to the prior 4-year period. And within January of this year, we obtained long sentences for several members of the Rendon Reyes trafficking organization. In that case, these were individuals from Mexico who, for more than 10 years, smuggled dozens or perhaps hundreds of women across the border, and young girls as well, some as young as 14 years old, or into the United States, and forced them into prostitution. And working with the Mexican government through the U.S.-Mexico bilateral human trafficking enforcement initiative, and with the FBI and with our prosecutors in the Civil Rights Division, we were able to bust up that international human trafficking ring, and there are others like that we see as well.
How many others do you feel are out there? And also, you say smuggled. By smuggled, I'm assuming they're not crossing the ports of entry. They're coming in through our porous border, correct?
Well, I think these human traffickers have different ways of bringing people across the border. They can bring them, there are various ways they can do it. And so the problem, I think, that we're seeing is there is a lot of deception happening by these human traffickers where they bring these people in, and these are typically very vulnerable individuals, both with respect to sex trafficking and forced labor. and they come into the United States, and they find themselves in these horrible conditions where they're forced to do things against their will. They're abused, mistreated, and it's a really terrible thing for them. And we do what we can to investigate these allegations, to bring prosecutions when appropriate. And in addition, through the Office of Justice Programs, we also help through the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, help to try to remedy the problems that these things have created for the victims of human trafficking.
Well, I hope we can eradicate 100% of human trafficking, especially in this day and age with technology, and we need to provide the resources to our men and women at the border so they can intercept these outfits who are smuggling young children across our border into the sex trade and forced labor. Not knowing how much time I have, I would like to move to another question. You say part of your job is protecting U.S. workers, and Buy American and Hire American executive order is something you force. Can you just tell me what sort of industries actually abuse this practice the most? And is this really commonplace, or is it something that's less, I guess, y'all are less engaged in, or is this something that you're highly engaged in?
It is something we are highly engaged in, Representative Palazzo. The right to work in this country free from discrimination includes the right to work free from national origin and citizenship discrimination. And so we enforce the anti-discrimination protections that are contained in the Immigration and Nationality Act. Our Immigrant and Employee Rights section initiated in early 2017 what we call the Protecting U.S. Workers Initiative. And what we've seen is that there are times when employers will discriminate because of citizenship status against American citizens, and our very dedicated career attorneys have taken very aggressive and appropriate action to remedy that when we're able to uncover it and find it.
Something a little more direct. You say employers abuse temporary visa programs to bring in, I guess, foreign or cheaper labor at the expense of American labor. I guess that's what I was more focused on, because I do know you pursue the others heavily, and rightfully so. So I guess what industries would be using temporary visa labor to and not use American labor and maybe abusing this process?
Well, Representative Palazzo, it does vary.
Okay.
We've seen it, for example, with respect to agriculture, for example. But it can happen in any industry, really. But the right to work without regard to discrimination because of citizenship, that does extend to American citizens as well. And American citizens have a right to work in this country without employers using their citizenship as Americans against them. And we have seen that happen, as you said.
That's one place we can find bipartisan support is Buy American, Hire American. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dryban, for being here today and for your work. Enforcement of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been crucial in increasing the Asian American community's access to the ballot. How many cases have been brought by the voting section under the Voting Rights Act since 2017?
Well, we have, as I said in my statement and I said in my written submission, we've participated in 6 cases under the Voting Rights Act at various levels of the federal courts. We're currently litigating a case in Michigan under the Voting Rights Act. And as you know, and I agree, Representative Meng, that the right to vote and the protections of the Voting Rights Act are among the most important rights that we have as Americans. They're enshrined in both the Constitution of the United States as well as in the Voting Rights Act and in other laws as well.
How is the section, voting section, assigning federal observers, and how many employees are detailed as observers?
Well, what we do when we decide about how to assign people is we look at, through our experts in our voting section, various polling places and jurisdictions that we think, based on the information available to us, may have been subject to problems of various kinds where there might be concerns going into an election, for example, into the 2018 election, about either the right to vote, a potential discrimination related to voting, the right to language access by the voters in particular jurisdictions where under the Voting Rights Act, they have a right to the ballot, even if they're unfamiliar with the English language. And so we take recommendations from our voting section attorneys and leadership there, and then we make judgments about how to disperse our resources throughout the United States.
Second question, you've mentioned this a little. The DOJ has been enforcing the Voting Rights Act for, let's say, over 50 years now, correct?
Yeah, the Voting Rights Act was enacted in 1965, and the Civil Rights Division has been enforcing it for a long time.
Has the DOJ previously used citizenship data from the American Community Survey to protect voting rights?
Representative Mang, I'm not familiar with that, with that service, so it's not something that I know off the top of my head.
Has the DOJ lost any Voting Rights Act enforcement cases in the last over 50 years because it did not have the citizenship information?
Representative Mang, I don't know the docket and the entire history of every case that the Civil Rights Division has brought since 1965. It certainly is the case generally that we don't win every case we bring, so I don't know the answer to your question about whether or not in the last 54 years or so we've ever lost a case based on the data or the survey that you're referring to.
Would like to follow up with your office to see if there were cases that were lost because you did not have the citizenship information. Secretary Ross has made reference to that previously in relation to the census and the need to include a citizenship question. One more question, sorry, before my time expires. In the 2015 Memorandum on Civil Rights Division Language Access Plan, can you update us on the continued community engagement and outreach activities the division has undertaken to engage with limited English proficiency individuals and communities?
Representative Meng, are you asking about like our efforts under the Voting Rights Act or?
Oh, separate. Just outreach and working together with limited English proficiency communities based on the 2015 memorandum that's still on your website.
I see. Well, Representative Meng, we have various laws that we enforce that seek to provide language access to people of limited English proficiency. I think in addition to the Voting Rights Act, we have a section that is very zealous with respect to language access through recipients of federal funding under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That law prohibits discrimination because of race and national origin, for example. And what we do see is that there are times when individuals may struggle with access, for example, to local courts or other areas where Title VI of the Civil Rights Act applies, and we do seek to enforce that. We also enforce the Equal Educational Opportunities Act, which ensures language access for limited English proficiency speakers through our Educational Opportunities section, and we enforce those laws in a variety of ways. Through investigations, through settlements, and if necessary, through litigation throughout the United States.
Thank you. I know my time's up. Would love to continue working together if there are groups that can be helpful in working together with the department. And then finally, if I can have 10 seconds, on your website there is a section to contact one's local FBI field office to report various types of incidents, such as hate crimes, etc. Of the 6 links, only the human trafficking link is functioning. The hate crimes, excessive force, force or threats in relation to reproductive health care services, damaging religious property, and the right to vote, 5 out of 6 are not functioning. So hope we can see those up and working soon.
Well, Representative Mang, thank you for your support of the Civil Rights Division. You know, to the extent our website is not working, it's something that that we will look into, and I thank you for bringing that to my attention, and we certainly look forward to your continued support and continuing to work with you.
Thank you, sir.
Providing the department with any questions for the record that you may not ask here. Ms. Lawrence.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excuse me. Under the Hate Crime Statistics Act of 1990, the FBI is required to collect and report hate crime statistic data from the nation's 18,000 federal, state, and local law enforcement officers. In 2017, the most recent data available, the FBI reported a 17% increase in hate crime, with increase in crime directed against individuals and institutions based on race, religion, and sexual orientation. How has this increase impacted the business of your organization? What are you doing to address this double-digit increase in just 1 year?
Representative Lawrence, thank you for your question. The Attorney General has made the prosecution of hate crimes a priority of the Department of Justice, and the prosecution of those crimes and the jurisdiction over those crimes is vested in the Civil Rights Division in our criminal section. And we have seen dozens and dozens of hate crimes throughout the United States. First, though, I'd like to address Representative Lawrence, your point about the data. One thing that we have done, and that the FBI has done, is try to obtain better and more reliable data about hate crimes reporting. There has been a challenge in the federal government to obtain reliable hate crimes data. There are some jurisdictions in this country, for example, that have never reported a hate crime, and we know that they've happened. And so we are working to obtain and are obtaining better data about that. We then, through our criminal section and through the FBI, are investigating allegations of hate crimes. We are bringing many, many hate crimes prosecutions throughout the United States, including those involving the murder of people because of their race, because of their sexual orientation, because of their religion, because of their status as transgendered individuals.
Can you tell me, you said he has made it a priority. What actions does that result in? So if something is a priority, obviously we have a real issue and a problem in America. And you even address we may not have the real scope of it. So when you say it's a priority, I want to know, what does a priority, how does things change in the department? Has there been requests for additional funding? Have you increased the number of staffing to address this issue? Because my concern is that while we're looking at data, it's business as usual. So if you can say something is a priority, but what are you doing to make sure that it is a priority?
Right. And Representative Lawrence, it's an excellent question and an important issue. What we have done are many different things. We have increased resources to our criminal section. When former Attorney General Sessions, for example, announced a hiring freeze at the Department of Justice, he exempted out our criminal section from that hiring freeze, so we were able to continue hiring people into our criminal section and to expand and increase the resources available for the investigations and prosecutions of hate crimes. We have established a website devoted to hate crimes. We are doing outreach to various individuals and organizations throughout the United States, and we have increased significantly our focus on both investigating hate crimes and prosecuting them when appropriate, including in places like Charlottesville, Virginia, which in August 2017 we saw what I regard at least as a very horrific series of events that led to the death of an individual and severe injuries by dozens of others. And so working with the FBI and the United States Attorney's Office there, we were able to obtain an indictment of an individual who was involved, we allege, in a hate crime. That case is pending. We've brought other cases, for example, at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, where we allege, case pending, we allege that an individual went into a synagogue and killed several people.
Exactly. My last question, Mr. Chair. So there's the anniversary of the Matthew Stewart and James Byrd Hate Crime Prevention Act. I'm a firm believer that your responsibility doesn't lie just internally, and I'm glad to hear what you're saying. What are you going to do to promote and be part of educating people on hate crimes, being proactive? What is the role of the Justice Department in ensuring that while we have, I feel personally, it's my belief, that we have a culture that is nurturing divisiveness and hate? What is your role, and how do you recognize an anniversary in this country that we're trying to prevent hate crimes? And that'll be my last question.
Representative Lawrence, I agree with you. I think we have a very serious problem in this country. We have what we call the Hate Crimes Enforcement Initiative, and we have outreach to local police and community leaders to deal with this issue. The Justice Department and the Civil Rights Division in particular is primarily a law enforcement organization, and so we are charged with and take very seriously our responsibilities under the Shepard-Byrd Hate Crime Prevention Act of 2009. We are devoting more resources to the enforcement of that law, and we are seeking through both our enforcement efforts, our outreach efforts, and our initiative to do everything we can to eradicate hate crimes and hatred from this country.
I close with this. I hope that includes training staff too on when you look at persecuting or prosecuting hate crimes, that the biases that inherently are in our system, that we train to remove those biases as well. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here today, Mr. Dreban. As you probably are aware, this past November, an overwhelming majority of Floridians, nearly 65% in fact, passed Amendment 4, restoring the right of over 1.4 million Floridians to vote. It was a great day, one that ended a dark chapter of Jim Crow-era politics in Florida. As governor of Florida, I was proud to restore the voting rights of over 155,000 nonviolent felons, because I believe in forgiveness and I believe in second chances, and that voting is in fact a civil right. And I was curious, do you believe that voting is a civil right in our country?
Representative Christ, yes, I believe that voting is a civil right in our country, and in fact, more than that, it's something that's enshrined in the Constitution of the United States and in our federal laws, including in particular the Voting Rights Act. I think one of the most important constitutional amendments in our history is the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which guaranteed the right to vote to individuals who were then experiencing and have since experienced significant race discrimination in this country, including especially with respect to their right to vote. And the Voting Rights Act, I think, reinforces that as well.
Thank you, sir. I'm encouraged by that, and I appreciate your answer. Do you think there should be a federal policy then to restore the rights of nonviolent felons to vote after they have paid their full debt to society?
Representative Christ, as I said, the right to vote is one of the most important rights that we have. It's fundamental to who we are as a democracy. With respect to the rights of felons to vote, that really is up to lawmakers and around the various states in this country, and you and your colleagues in the Congress. Our duty at the Civil Rights Division is to enforce the laws within our jurisdiction, including the Voting Rights Act and the National Voter Registration Act, the Help America Voter Act, and other laws. Right now, we do not have a law that we are trusted with enforcing that seeks to address that issue, but it's something that really is up to lawmakers in this country, and our duty at the Civil Rights Division is to enforce the laws within our jurisdiction, and that's what we do.
Is it also to enforce the Constitution?
Yes, of course.
Didn't you cite that because of the federal Constitution that there should be protections of voting rights, and shouldn't that extend to those who have paid their debt to society? I mean, do you have to have a law? I don't mean to interrupt. Forgive me. I'm sorry.
you cited that it would be nice to have a law. I agree. But we also have a Constitution. And if the Constitution would extend that right and give that right to your department, wouldn't it be appropriate to enforce that nationwide?
Representative,
Constitution.
yeah, Representative Chris, certainly constitutional rights are the most fundamental rights we have in our country. And if the United States were to amend the Constitution to extend a constitutional right to convicted felons, then that would broaden the right to vote to those individuals and would enshrine it in the Constitution. Right now, the Constitution does not address that issue, as far as I know anyway, but it is something that I think you and your colleagues in the Congress and the various state legislatures around the country can consider and decide how to proceed.
Thank you. I'm not sure how much time I have left, but I have another area of little bit. 1 minute. As you know, the Department of Justice filed a brief in the case of Zarda versus Altitude Express, arguing that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act does not protect an employee from being discriminated against on the basis of their sexual orientation. From my understanding, this interpretation runs counter to the previous administration's interpretation. Can you explain to me the impetus for the decision-making and the change, and why did the department decide to reverse course?
Well, Representative Christ, the brief that you're referring to was filed by the department before, in I think 2017, before I joined the department. So I did not personally participate
That is correct.
in that brief.
You're correct.
Generally speaking, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act is the law that was at issue and is at issue in that case. That case, as I think relevant to your question, protects applicants for employment and employees and even former employees from discrimination because of sex. The federal courts of appeals have split on the question of whether or not the sex discrimination prohibitions of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 extend protections because of sexual orientation. That case, as well as other cases presenting similar issues, are currently pending at the Supreme Court of the United States. And we look forward to the Supreme Court's decision, and we remain fully committed to enforcing the protections of that law with respect to sex discrimination and the other protected categories contained in Title VII.
You're aware, and this will be it, Mr. Chairman, in February of 2018, the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit ruled in Zarda's favor, arguing that Title VII prohibits sexual orientation employment discrimination under the category of sex.
Representative Christ, yes, I am aware of the decision by the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit in the Zarda case. As I mentioned, that case then is now pending before the Supreme Court of the United States. It has been pending up there since shortly after the Second Circuit issued its decision, and we'll see what the Supreme Court does with it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Dryban, there was a extensive article in Vice News about 6 days ago that I'm looking at right now. Is by a gentleman named Rob Arthur. The title was "Exclusive: Trump's Justice Department is Investigating 60% Fewer Civil Rights Cases Than Obama's." The lead paragraph says, "The Trump administration is pursuing far fewer civil rights cases, including hate crimes, police bias, and disability rights cases than the Obama or Bush administration did," an exclusive Vice News analysis of DOJ data shows. The second paragraph says, "The DOJ Civil Rights Division, which has enforced nearly every pivotal moment of rights reform since its creation in '57, has started 60% fewer cases against potential violations, and 50% fewer than both Obama and Trump." And it purports to be based on, for the objective facts in here, it's got plenty of subjectivity in it, as you can imagine. But the objective facts purport to be based on actual DOJ stats, mostly online. Are you familiar with this article? Have you read it?
Representative Case, no, I'm not familiar with the article, and the description of the Civil Rights Division that you just read to me is inconsistent with what I've seen since I joined the department.
Okay. So you haven't read it, you haven't heard about it?
I have not read the article. It's possible I may have heard of the article, but I haven't read it.
Okay.
And
Is there some way that we can talk apples to apples about whether, in fact, enforcement actions have increased, declined, or remained stable over time? I mean, I understand, in my understanding of enforcement actions, limited understanding, is that an enforcement action results from a formal investigation. So in other words, an actual formal action by DOJ for a potential civil rights violation. Would we be on the same page if we talked in those terms?
Well, Representative Case, I think it would depend on the statute and the type of case. Each of the statutes within our jurisdiction have enforcement mechanisms and procedures that vary from statute to statute. So it's hard to compare, for example, some statutes where we routinely settle matters civilly, for example, with a criminal investigation, or matters where we frequently litigate.
How would you define an enforcement action? How would you define an enforcement action?
I would define an enforcement action first by looking to the particular statute that we might discuss.
Okay, let's just start with that. Let's accept that definition. I accept it. Have those enforcement actions, whatever the statute is, whatever the department is, have they gone up, down? What's happening to the actual enforcement actions? Because the subjective conclusion of this article, and it's not a new conclusion, this has been out there for a while, the suspicion and fear of many that this administration is not enforcing our civil rights statutes to the same degree as Republican and Democratic presidents previously, and has some degree of animus even to the enforcement of civil rights statutes in some areas at least. How do you respond to that? What is the empirical evidence to disprove that?
Well, Representative Case, I think it's very unfortunate that anyone would believe the type of myth that you just described. The notion that the Civil Rights Division is hostile civil rights is deeply insulting to me and to my colleagues at the Civil Rights Division, and it simply is untrue.
Okay.
With respect to enforcement actions, I could cite, for example, the fact that our human trafficking prosecutions in the most recent 4-year period are up by an 82% number from the prior 4-year period. I could also point to the fact that the Civil Rights Division since 2017 has brought a record number of investigations and pattern or practice lawsuits under our Sexual Harassment and Housing Initiative under the Fair Housing Act. I could point to dozens and dozens of hate crimes prosecutions that we have brought.
I'm prepared to accept the empirical evidence that you are, in fact, enforcing the civil rights statutes. I'm just concerned that there is so much out there, some of which purports to be based on very objective evidence from the DOJ saying that's not the case. It may be the case in some of your departments, but it may not be the case in others. So what I'm trying to get to the bottom of, is this unfair or not? I mean, what do the facts actually show about whether this administration and this DOJ is continuing to vigorously enforce the Civil Rights Acts as prior administrations have? That's the basic question that I have.
And Representative Case, I think it's an excellent question, and I'm here telling you that the message that I have given to our career staff in the Civil Rights Division since I joined the department, which was in November of 2018, is that we support and will continue to pursue aggressive and zealous enforcement of the civil rights laws. That includes all of the laws within our jurisdiction. We do have limited resources, so we have to make judgments about how to deploy our resources. So the numbers may vary, but in this notion that there is some kind of hostility towards the civil rights laws is wholly inconsistent with everything I have seen since I've joined the Department of Justice. And
Okay, how many attorneys do you have right now?
we have, I don't recall the exact number, I mentioned it, it's in my statement, approximately 370 attorneys or thereabouts. It's a rough number.
Okay, FY20, I'm just looking at your own information. FY19 continuing resolution, 369 attorneys. Allegation is that you're having a little higher than normal non-retention. In other words, people are leaving and are not being replaced. I don't know if that's correct or not, but I do note that in your FY 2020 budget request, you've only asked for an extra 2 attorneys. So that means to me, either you think you're fully staffed, or you don't have any, you are not seeing an increase in enforcement actions, or some other reason that I'm not sure. What explains? To me, it strikes me as unusual that we are seeing only a 2 attorney increase when we feel so much apparent increase. I don't know if it's justified or not, but there feels like more interest, more demand for the U.S. government to enforce civil rights actions, and yet the attorney load that you're asking for is not very significant.
Well, Representative Case, of course, the budget is something that you and your colleagues will determine. I note here, for example, that in fiscal year 2017, we had, the numbers that I have in front of me are 278 attorneys, and that number went from 278 to 369 in 2018, stayed that way in 2019, and we're asking or projecting for 371, as you say. Obviously, we in the Civil Rights Division do have limited resources. It's up to you and your colleagues here in the Congress to determine how much money to appropriate to us. So that's a judgment for you to make.
Is that your judgment? Is that your judgment that plus 2 attorneys is sufficient for your needs to enforce our civil rights statutes?
That, Representative Case, that's the proposal, and we will certainly do our best to enforce these laws within our jurisdiction and use the limited resources that we have. Obviously, the government does not have unlimited resources. And you and your colleagues on this subcommittee and in the Congress need to make judgments, given the competing demands that you have, about how to allocate the taxpayer dollars. And we'll do everything I can with the resources that you and your colleagues decide to appropriate to us. We very much appreciate your support, as well as those of your colleagues, and we're remain committed and will be committed to enforcing the civil rights laws.
Thank you.
Ms. Capter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome. Mr. Dreeben, we had a congressman and mayor from Cincinnati named Driehaus. Attorney General Sessions issued a memo right before he left, limiting the use of consent decrees in civil rights enforcement cases. That was his last act in office, and I'm curious, we know that those instruments put all parties on the record, and I wonder what the impact of his memo has been to date. How many consent decrees, to your knowledge, have been entered into by the Civil Rights Division, by this administration, by section?
Representative Capter, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, you are correct that the former Attorney General Sessions did sign a memorandum about consent decrees. That memorandum is limited to consent decrees with state and local government institutions, cities, counties, states, things of that nature. That memorandum established a process internally at the Justice Department for both standards that govern consent decrees and the process for obtaining approval of consent decrees in the department. They apply to both the Civil Rights Division and to all other litigating components of the department. In terms of consent decrees versus other forms of resolving disputes, the way that works and the way we use them is that we use consent decrees as well as settlement agreements to resolve a dispute in our civil prosecution of the federal civil rights laws. They do vary in terms of the type of settlement that we seek to obtain in particular cases. So we have both settlement agreements and consent decrees, and we use them as best we can using our judgment. With respect to your particular question about section by section, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. We have 11 sections in the Civil Rights Division. 10 of those 11 involve civil type claims. One is a policy section that doesn't litigate cases, but the other ones do litigate cases civilly. Our criminal section, of course, they bring indictments, obtain guilty pleas and things like that, and convictions. So with respect to consent decrees, our civil litigating sections use them, and we use them frequently, usually to settle matters that are filed in federal courts.
Could you have your staff prepare those numbers? How long would it take you to submit that to us on behalf of this administration?
I'm sorry, how long? I don't, Representative Capture, I'm not sure how long it would take. I would have to take that back to the Department of Justice and see what kind of data we have about it.
All I'm asking is for this administration, by section, how many of the consent decrees have been entered into by the Civil Rights Division? How many by section? That should be fairly easy during this administration, since it's been sworn in.
Representative Capture, I will look into that and take that back to the department and do what we can find out, what we can find out for you on that. We certainly appreciate your support and continue to work with you and your colleagues on this subcommittee and here in the Congress.
Thank you. I just wanted to move to the housing arena, if I could, an area I have a great interest in. The housing section does not appear to have brought a single fair housing case based on race discrimination in this administration. Perhaps my information is not up to date. Why, could you possibly explain this, and why would the Department of Justice be ignoring the law, a powerful tool that this particular section provides us? Do you have no lawyers in that section?
Representative Capture, we enforce the Fair Housing Act through our Housing and Civil Enforcement section. We have several dozen lawyers in that section. With respect to the different kinds of cases they bring, they, of course, as I mentioned earlier, have brought a record number of sexual harassment investigations and pattern or practice sexual harassment cases. With respect to race discrimination cases under the Fair Housing Act, I have instructed them that I regard race discrimination protections of the Fair Housing Act as very important and something that I fully support, and I work with them to do that and to bring those cases as well. It's something we're working on, and we're investigating and litigating all kinds of cases through our Housing and Civil Enforcement section, and not just with respect to race and sex discrimination, but on behalf of individuals with disabilities and on behalf of other protected categories as well.
Well, it's from the data I have, and again, it could be wrong, but it appears that the housing section has not brought a single fair housing case in 2 years since the administration took office based on race discrimination. Is that possible?
Representative Capture, that does not sound correct to me. I don't have the data as I'm sitting here today, but you know, certainly the race discrimination protections of the Fair Housing Act, I think, are among the most important protections embodied in the Fair Housing Act. In fact, the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968 primarily to get at race discrimination in housing, and that law passed shortly after the terrible and tragic assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and it was designed to eradicate race and other forms of discrimination in housing. I know, as I say, we have seen a significant increase in sexual harassment, in particular in housing, and these are very disturbing cases where what we often see are male landlords who coerce, threaten, intimidate, very often low-income and vulnerable women into threats of sexual favors in exchange for rent or rent discounts, things of that nature, and we're prosecuting a record number of those.
Thank you for that.
Sure, and we also receive referrals from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, where we prosecute those cases as well, and through our Housing and Civil Enforcement
In
section.
the way you're structured, do you have someone in charge of the housing litigation? Is there someone?
Yeah, the structure of our the Civil Rights Division with respect to our Housing and Civil Enforcement section is that we have a Deputy Assistant Attorney General who reports to my principal deputy and to me. He is a career attorney who has been at the department for more than 20 years. Then we have an individual who is the chief of our Housing and Civil Enforcement section. She likewise is a career attorney, and she reports to our Deputy Assistant Attorney General. And the two of them, working with me and with the other people in our Housing and Civil Enforcement section and the leadership of that section, investigate and litigate allegations of housing discrimination, among other things.
Thank you. So it would be easy for you to get back to us fairly quickly on whether what I stated is correct, and that is that the administration has not brought a single housing case, fair housing case, based on race discrimination in this administration. You could check with that person and get back to us fairly quickly, right? So you could
well,
verify what
could-
I'm saying is true.
Yeah, I don't, yeah, well, Representative Capture, certainly I can check with the leadership of our Housing and Civil Enforcement section.
Thank you.
And in fact, I talk with them frequently. I've met with them several times this week, for example.
You know, Jones Day has a big legal operation in Cleveland, Ohio also. And I'd be very, very interested in an answer to that question, sir. Lou Stokes, one of my predecessors from Ohio, was very intent on this issue. And I admired his work and the work that we've done as a country to heal these racial divides. So I would be very grateful for that information. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Dryban, how much staffing and funding does the division devote to police reform?
Well, I would say two of our sections primarily deal with police departments in this, through the Civil Rights Division. Our special litigation section and our criminal section. But of course, other sections of the Justice Department and the Civil Rights Division also do it as well. For example, police departments are governed by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in that they are prohibited from discrimination because of race, sex, and other protected traits. And our employment litigation section enforces that law. So it does vary by statute. Each of those sections, the three of the sections that I mentioned, have several dozen attorneys and investigators and other professionals who work with them.
Now, from your knowledge, is that particular dedicated funds amount lower than it's been in past years? Has it held steady over a period of time?
Well, I think that the numbers vary. They vary from section to section in terms of increases or decreases in staffing. Some sections have more attrition than others. So, for example, our criminal section has seen increase in staffing in the last couple of years, but it does vary by section.
And how many reform agreements are now in place? And how many are under consideration, either in negotiation or in implementation?
Chairman Serrano, I'm sorry, what kind of agreements were you asking about? I didn't quite hear that.
Reform agreements.
Well, Chairman Serrano, we enter into different kind of agreements with police departments. They could be in the form of a settlement agreement of a disputed matter. They could be in the form of a consent decree, as I was talking earlier. So it does vary in terms of the form of the agreement. We don't use the term reform agreement when we settle a matter with the police department or any other organization or institution. So it does vary in terms of the type of resolution that we have with these organizations. But so I'm not sure how to respond more precisely
But
than
you
that.
mentioned consent decrees, and we have an understanding that there have been less of those agreed to. Is that correct?
I don't, Chairman Serrano, I don't know the numbers of the consent decrees that this Civil Rights Division has entered into. We have entered into many, many consent decrees through the various sections of the Civil Rights Division over the last few years. many of which predate my arrival, obviously. But so I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. I think it would vary from section to section of the Civil Rights Division.
Okay, well, you can provide that on the record, and we'll also provide you with more information to clarify our questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Serrano.
On November 7th, former Attorney General Sessions issued a policy memo to curtail the use of judicial consent decrees, saying it is not the responsibility of the federal government to manage non-federal law enforcement agencies. Has the policy been implemented, and did it lead to terminating agreements or setting deadlines?
Chairman Serrano, you're correct that on November 7th of 2018, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions did sign a memorandum about consent decrees with respect to state and local government institutions. That memorandum established certain kinds of procedures, both with respect to obtaining approval of consent decrees and standards that govern consent decrees. The memorandum has not resulted in any kind of artificial termination of any consent decree within the jurisdiction of the Civil Rights Division since it issued, nor have I given any direction to anyone in the Civil Rights Division to terminate any existing consent decree artificially or otherwise as a result of that memorandum. So consent decrees that existed before that memorandum and that have not otherwise expired remain in place, and our various sections of the Civil Rights Division continue to enforce them. We do consult, as a result of the memorandum, with the Office of the Associate Attorney General, for example, or the Deputy Attorney General as appropriate. And we're continuing, though, marching on and soldiering on with respect to our law enforcement activities.
Then you wouldn't know how many agreements were affected and where they were affected.
Chairman, sorry, I didn't hear the last part of your question.
And you
What was
wouldn't know how many of these agreements were affected and where at this point.
Yeah, Chairman Serrano, in terms of the existing agreements, I don't believe any of them were affected at all. We don't read that memorandum to be retroactive or anything like that to affect pending consent decrees. Rather, it was a directive, at least as I read it, on a going forward basis about how the Civil Rights Division, but not just the Civil Rights Division, but the Justice Department generally, will seek to obtain consent decrees with respect to state and local government organizations and institutions, respecting, of course, the federalism concerns that are at issue in those cases, because when we have state and local government organizations and the federal government bringing enforcement actions in those cases.
In your confirmation hearing, you testified that, and I'm quoting, the Division Special Litigation Section is entrusted with the role of enforcing federal laws, protecting the civil rights of individuals in our communities who interact with state or local law enforcement officers, end of quote. You also said that while intervention may not be appropriate in every case, the division must stand ready and willing to assist state and local authorities when necessary. With that in mind, what standards should DOJ use to identify organizations in need of review or reform?
Yeah, we, through our special litigation section, we enforce a variety of statutes, and we gain information about alleged violations of those statutes in different ways, through the local communities, through advocacy groups, through individuals. Our special litigation section then conducts investigations as appropriate. Again, each law varies in terms of the exact process available to us. For example, some statutes provide subpoena power during investigations in civil matters and others do not. For example, the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act, which is one of the laws that the Special Litigation Section is entrusted with enforcing, that does, thanks to amendments by you and your colleagues in the Congress, does authorize us to issue subpoenas, for example, to compel production of information. Under that law, for example, we recently issued findings letters against both a jail in Kentucky and a prison in Virginia, where we found that there was a pattern of practice of violations of the Constitution by law enforcement officials in those cases, and those occurred after lengthy and thorough investigations by the very dedicated staff and attorneys in the Special Litigation Section of the Civil Rights Division. And we're now working with those institutions, hopefully to bring about a resolution to those alleged violations, and to make sure that in those cases the institutions are complying fully with the Constitution of the United States and the federal civil rights laws that are within our jurisdiction.
Thank you. Mr. Adderholm?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we talked a little bit about the prosecution of hate crimes. But let me ask you about the incidences of hate crimes in general. You may have mentioned this, but clarify this. Or would you say the incidence of the actual crimes are growing, staying the same, or decrease?
Excuse me. Ranking Member Adderhold, with respect to hate crimes, I think what I can say is that we think the data are improving. In other words, the reporting of hate crimes and the data available to us is better and getting better, and it's something that the Federal Bureau of Investigation is working very hard on, along with our criminal section at the Justice Department. So the data are better, which is helpful. In terms of an accurate measure of how many hate crimes are occurring in this country, I think that's more difficult to say. As I said earlier, we are concerned that there are jurisdictions in this country that have not reported hate crimes at all, and yet we are confident that those hate crimes are occurring. So I think that the good news is the data are better, and we are committing more resources to prosecuting hate crimes, to reaching out to local law enforcement and community organizations and individuals to uncover instances of hate crimes and to take appropriate action where we find
So it may not be that the actual hate crimes are growing so much as there's better information regarding the incidences that are out there are being reported now more than they were in the past. Is that safe to say?
Ranking Member Adderholt, yes. I think that, as I say, the data are better, and that improvement in the data enables us to identify hate crimes and investigate them, and when appropriate, working with local law enforcement, bring appropriate actions, including criminal prosecution of those who commit such crimes.
Let me shift just a bit on talk about hate crime hoax, and of course they can be as damaging as actual hate crimes. Worse still, hate crime hoaxes compound the injury by unjustly defaming the category of individual identified with the perceived characteristics of the perpetrator or the perpetrators. Has your division ever been involved with the prosecution of a hate crime hoax?
Representative Adderholt, I'm not familiar of whether or not the Civil Rights Division has ever prosecuted a hate crimes hoax. I agree with you that any kind of hoax about a hate crime is a very serious thing and can damage public perceptions about victims of hate crimes. They can also involve criminal misconduct as well. If, for example, an individual is falsely reporting a hate crime, may make a material false statement to an FBI agent, for example, that's a felony. Likewise, if an individual goes into a grand jury or otherwise testifies under oath falsely about a hate crime, that likewise could be criminal perjury and could be prosecuted. So these are very serious things, but they're also serious from the standpoint of public confidence in criminal justice, and I think they seek to undermine victims of hate crimes when people perpetrate hoaxes about them.
Public colleges and universities are, of course, bound by the Constitution since they're institutions of government, yet freedom of speech and religious liberty come under attack far too often on public campuses. What responsibility do public institutions have to afford equal access to facilities and resources for faith-based student organizations, including organizations that promote viewpoints that are unpopular with the leadership of the university itself?
Well, Ranking Member Adeholt, religious liberty is, like voting, one of the most important protections we have in the Constitution of the United States. It is something the founders enshrined in the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, including in particular the free exercise of religion. And it's something that public institutions, because they are governmental organizations, have a duty to comply with and to respect the free exercise of religion of those individuals within their community. We have seen in the Civil Rights Division that there are times when certain public institutions have taken actions that we regard as in violation of the First Amendment. For example, we had a case recently, a case called Business Leaders in Christ versus the University of Iowa, where the University of Iowa deregistered a religious student group, and we concluded that it did so in violation of the First Amendment. We filed with the Federal District Court in Iowa a statement of interest explaining the standards that govern such claims. And the federal court there did agree with us, found that the University of Iowa violated the First Amendment with respect to this religious student group there. And we've seen that in other circumstances as well.
Well, that was going to be my next question. So that's been a recent effort that y'all have worked on there with that University of Iowa case.
Ranking Member Adel, yes, that is one case of various cases where we at the Civil Rights Division have found that various public institutions appear, at least to us, to have violated the First Amendment religious liberty protections. And what we do and have done in those cases typically is to advise the federal courts of this and advise them of the standards that govern and the standards that these public institutions should adhere to, and then the courts take appropriate action in whatever cases are
And I'm
pending.
sure that in this particular case, University of Iowa took the appropriate action and let this group back on the campus.
Well, I don't know what the University of Iowa has done. So the decision issued very recently, and so I don't know whether the University of Iowa has come into compliance with the First Amendment. I certainly hope they have. What we do know is that the federal court in that case did agree with us and issued a decision, a very thorough decision, about the violation of the First Amendment that it
What
found.
federal court was it that issued that ruling? Do you recall offhand?
Yeah, it was. It was a federal court in Iowa. I don't remember what district court it was, but it was in the state of Iowa.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. In your testimony, you talk about protecting service members' right to vote, also their reemployment rights when they deploy. And we know over the past 2 decades, we've had hundreds of thousands of men and women deployed in all over the nation, primarily in the Middle East. Can you briefly describe your efforts and are the trends positive or negative again in employees and employers and states? I guess in one sense, making sure that they're able to vote when they're serving overseas, but also their reemployment upon returning home. Just what you've seen in your office, and are we trending in the right direction?
Yes, we have, as I mentioned in my written submission, Representative Pallanza, we are focused on protecting service members against discrimination and against deprivation of their right to vote. So we enforce a law called the Uniform Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act, as well as 2 other laws, I think, that are relevant to protections, at least within our jurisdiction, for service members. The Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, that protects the right of service members who are outside the United States to vote. The Service Members Civil Relief Act also provides protections. For example, we've seen cases where certain auto lenders have seized property in violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, foreclosed on mortgages, things like that, when our service members are outside the United States or might even be fighting in a place of combat. Under the Uniform Service Employment and Reemployment Rights Act, the USERRA is what that law is known as. We've seen instances where service members have lost their jobs in violation of the law or have otherwise suffered adverse employment consequences. And so when we found that, and we have found it, we take appropriate action, and including up to filing lawsuits against individuals or organizations that may violate these protections.
As the chairman of the National Guard and Reserve Components Caucus, and as a veteran myself and a current member of the Mississippi National Guard, I mean, we have a largest contingent of National Guardsmen returning from overseas. They spent a year in the Middle East, and we have another group from Laurel, the 184th Sustainment Command, that's in the middle of their deployment. You know, these things are important, and you know, I just want to thank the employers that continue to hire National Guardsmen and reservists, especially in light of the tempo that we've had over the past 20 years. It's really admirable of them. And in fact, in Congress, we've tried to make it even more appealing by providing tax credits for those who hire men and women in uniform and then are deployed to help, again, just incentivize people to continue hiring men and women in uniform, because they do make some of the best employees out there. You know, we've kind of focused on, you know, protecting the right to vote, protecting, you know, the American citizens' vote is extremely important to me. Just last week on H.R. 1, which I think it's called for the People's Act, and some people think it's for the Politicians Act, more of an incumbent protection program. I mean, we heard crazy things like reducing the voting age to 16, you know, allowing, you know, we actually had I guess a motion to recommit, or a statement to, you know, and it was by Congressman Dan Crenshaw, to basically prohibit people who are here illegally from voting in our federal elections. But yet many of my colleagues thought that it was okay for people here illegally to vote in federal elections. And when you look at California actually has local ordinance that allow not only illegals to obtain driver's license, but to vote in local elections. What are we doing to protect our vote? Because I think it sends a horrific message. And are we doing anything to go after the voter fraud in these cities because basically they're in direct violation of federal law? Because I'm assuming if they're voting in local elections, they're voting in federal elections as well.
Well, Representative Palazzo, first, let me address your comments about our service members, with which I agree. Our very dedicated women and men who put on the uniform are willing literally to put their lives at risk to protect the liberties we have in this country. This is a tradition that goes back to the Continental Army and during the American Revolution, as you know. And they do so, among other things, to protect the right to vote. And I think when we see violations of that right, it's something that the Justice Department takes very seriously. In the Civil Rights Division, we are entrusted with enforcing the civil rights protections related to voting. Voter fraud, when it happens, is within the jurisdiction of the Criminal Division of the Justice Department. And you know, my focus as head of the Civil Rights Division, of course, is to focus on the laws within our jurisdiction. But I do know that we have many very fine lawyers in the Criminal Division at the Justice Department, and they work with the FBI to investigate any claims or allegations of voter fraud when they happen. It's not something that I'm personally involved in, because because of the jurisdiction that we have in the Civil Rights Division. But I agree with you that it's an important issue, and it's one that we should all be concerned about as Americans.
Thank you for your public service, and thank you for coming out today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Representative Palazzo.
I can't let it pass, my good friend, and I mean my good friend, Mr. Palazzo. No Democrat supported undocumented folks from voting in elections. It is a good approach that is used every time we bring up voter suppression or the difficulty of that is made in some states for you to vote, that the other side brings up voting by undocumented. I don't know what it feels like to be an undocumented person. I was born a citizen in a territory. But everything I know about these folks is that they would rather stay in the shadows The last thing they want to do is get caught voting in an election that they're not supposed to be voting in, because that would be the end of their stay here, or worse, they would stay here under another circumstance behind bars. So I don't think that that's something for us to worry about. Let me ask you one last question, and then we'll wrap it up and let you go enforce the laws, you know. FY19 proposed to put community relations services in your division. Is this a good idea in your opinion?
Well, the Community Relations Service historically has been separate from the Civil Rights Division. I understand there is a proposal to make it part of the Civil Rights Division. The Community Relations Service historically has served a different function than we do in the Civil Rights Division, in that the Community Relations Service has historically helped work with communities in an amicable way to calm tensions, to build trust, oftentimes when there are various controversies in a particular community. In the Civil Rights Division, as I've said earlier, and you referenced Chairman Serrano, we are primarily charged with enforcing the laws within our jurisdiction through either criminal prosecution or civil lawsuits or investigations, things of that sort. So with respect to the proposal, I really think that's something that you and your colleagues here in the House of Representatives and your peers over in the United States Senate should decide. Whatever you decide and whatever you do, we'll do our duty as best we can. And if you decide and your colleagues decide to combine the Community Relations Service with the Civil Rights Division, we'll do our best to make sure that that both the Community Relations Service and the Civil Rights Division can continue to function as best and efficiently as they can, given the limited resources that you and your colleagues appropriate to us.
Thank you. Mr. Adderhold, do you have any closing comments? Let me just thank you for being here with us today. And I'll end the way I started. You know, I come from a generation of people who saw the Justice Department as the one place you went to for relief. And every time the Justice Department got involved, it was not to hurt someone unless somebody was doing something wrong. It was to defend the rights of people, and even those who were in the margins of society in many ways, financially and otherwise, felt protected. And as I said before, for the African American community, it became that one place, especially, where the justice could be brought about. And so I would hope that that's still the feeling. I would hope that that's what you consider to instill in the people who work in this section. And I would hope that we can continue to have a Justice Department that we can remedy what's wrong, grow on what's right, and serve the people well. And I thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Serrano.
And this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.